For 6 months, the King of Scotland sleeps in caves, eats bark, and moves only at night because every road in his kingdom carries an English patrol with orders to take his head. What happens next should be impossible. The same man who is hunted like a wounded animal through his own wilderness will engineer one of the most precise military traps of the medieval age. Before that moment arrives, the closest female relatives of Robert the Bruce will be locked in iron-latticed wooden cages and hung publicly from English battlements for 4 years. The mechanism that transforms a fugitive into a sovereign remains hidden in the northern mist, and it begins not on a battlefield, but in a cave on a small Irish island. A sovereign kingdom transforms into an occupied territory when a genealogical vacuum leaves Scotland without a direct heir. Heavy iron-shod hooves of English warhorses stamp through the border mud as King Edward I asserts absolute imperial dominion over the fractured realm. The English crown deploys a mathematically superior network of garrisons, establishing an overwhelming administrative and military stranglehold that no domestic faction can match. This structural supremacy creates a suffocating trap for the local nobility, rendering conventional resistance completely impossible. The machinery of foreign law prepares to crush any spark of rebellion before it can even ignite. An irreversible line is crossed inside the sanctuary of the Greyfriars Kirk on a frozen February morning. Robert the Bruce draws a sharp steel dagger and strikes down his chief political rival, the Red Comyn, directly before the high altar. Blood pools on the consecrated stone, instantly shattering any hope of a peaceful compromise with the English crown. Bruce believes this sudden, violent purge will shock the fractured Scottish nobility into immediate submission under his royal banner. He stakes his entire survival on a single, desperate gamble for a crown he has not yet earned. A simple gold circlet presses into the brow of the newly crowned king during a hurried ceremony at Scone. Isabella Macduff steps forward to place the makeshift diadem upon his head, defying her own family to perform the hereditary ritual. Across the border, Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, marches out from his headquarters at Perth to suppress the sacrilegious uprising. Valence commands a professional force of 3,000 disciplined veterans, including highly trained crossbowmen and heavy cavalry. The English lieutenant intends to execute a methodical campaign of total eradication across the lowlands. The English lieutenant expects a conventional, short-lived rebellion that will collapse under the weight of traditional feudal authority. Valence calculates his strategy based entirely on standard medieval warfare, assuming the outlaw king will rely on chivalric protocol and formal battle challenges. Bruce behaves exactly as expected, marching his inexperienced levies directly toward the fortified walls of Perth to offer open combat. The Scottish king is a master of terrain manipulation, but he remains fatally blinded by the idealistic codes of his upbringing. Both commanders are operating under profound delusions as their forces converge in the deep woods of Methven. A sudden midnight assault shatters the chivalric illusion as English cavalry crashes through the undefended Scottish camp. Valence completely ignores the traditional truce, ordering his armored vanguard to strike while the unsuspecting rebels are sleeping. Glittering iron lances tear through tents and flesh, turning the dark forest into a chaotic slaughterhouse within minutes. Bruce is unhorsed in the frantic melee, escaping execution only when his remaining knights form a desperate human shield around his body. The regular Scottish army ceases to exist before the sun can rise over the trees. A narrow mountain pass south of Tindrum becomes a lethal trap when Highland axes gleam in the summer rain. The MacDougals of Lorne launch a brutal ambush against the few hundred survivors fleeing westward into the trackless wilderness. Lochaber axes cleave through the remaining Scottish horses, forcing the king into a desperate rearguard action to save his household. The brooch of Lorne is torn from the king's cloak by a dying man during the savage, close-quarters struggle. Bruce escapes into the mist, stripped of his royal insignia and completely isolated. The massive stone walls of Kildrummy Castle failed to protect the royal household from the relentless English pursuit. Treachery opens the gates, resulting in the immediate capture of the Bruce women and the execution of his youngest brother. On the remote island of Rathlin, the fugitive king watches a small spider struggle repeatedly to anchor its web against the damp cave ceiling. This persistent creature inspires a profound psychological transformation within the isolated leader as winter locks the Irish Sea. He resolves to abandon traditional warfare entirely to embrace a ruthless strategy of survival. Within 12 months of his coronation, The king's original plan of a conventional chivalric uprising lies completely ruined. A disastrous landing at Loch Ryan results in the immediate capture and beheading of his remaining brothers by English loyalists. Bruce adapts to this absolute devastation by discarding every rule of noble combat, melting into the rugged hills of Galloway. He commands his followers to dismantle every captured castle, preventing the enemy from using permanent fortifications against his mobile forces. The struggle transforms into a relentless, asymmetric conflict fought in the shadows of the forest. When the deep silence of Glen turns into a slaughterhouse, Bruce commits his remaining forces to a lethal trap along a narrow mountain track, bordering the dark waters of the loch. Massive granite boulders crash down the steep heights, instantly crushing the English vanguard and sowing total panic among the cavalry. Lightly armored Scottish infantry charges down the rocky slope to annihilate the disorganized survivors in fierce hand-to-hand combat. This victory proves the doctrine works, but Glen is a mountain ambush against a patrol, not an army. The English crown still commands thousands of professional soldiers, trained cavalry, and the resources of an entire kingdom. Bruce has proven he can win in the shadows. The question now is whether his engineered terrain can hold against a force that outnumbers him 5-1 on open ground in broad daylight. That test is 12 days away. This sudden, crushing victory proves that the terrain can defeat a professional army. The definitive confrontation looms as both armies converge on the plain south of Loudoun Hill in early May. Bruce arrives days before the enemy, carefully measuring the topography to prepare an engineered defensive line across the dry ground. He does not commission this work from engineers. He cuts the first ditch himself, a king kneeling in the mud with a blade, dismantling 7 centuries of chivalric doctrine, one shovelful at a time. 600 Scottish spearmen stand in tightly packed schiltrons, their long wooden pikes forming an impassable wall of sharpened timber. The king deliberately selects a position bordered by deep, treacherous peat bogs on either side, neutralizing any possibility of a flanking maneuver. He stands ready to test his new tactical doctrine against the ultimate threat. The English lieutenant expects a rapid, crushing victory over a band of outlaws trapped in the open field. Valence arrives with 3,000 professional soldiers, his heavy cavalry gleaming in the morning sun as they deploy for battle. He sees only a small force of unarmored infantry blocking the highway, completely ignoring the landscape hidden beneath the grass. 3 parallel ditches cut deep into the narrow strip of land, creating an invisible filtering mechanism designed to destroy the momentum of a mounted charge. The entire English front advances directly into the concealed trap. Ironclad warhorses surge forward on a single command as the English vanguard launches a thunderous, direct assault. Valence relies entirely on numerical superiority and traditional momentum, confident that heavy cavalry will easily break the peasant schiltrons. The thundering of thousands of hooves fills the narrow valley, masking the soft, treacherous nature of the soil ahead. On the opposite side, Bruce watches the cavalry advance, knowing his entire strategy depends on the engineering of the ground. The gap between expectation and reality closes as the horses reach maximum speed. An irreversible disaster unfolds the moment the leading English knights strike the hidden network of ditches. Horses stumble and collapse into the deep pits, their immense momentum throwing armored riders into the soft, unyielding mud. The narrow 500-yard neck of dry land funnels the charging lines into a dense, chaotic bottleneck where numbers are useless. The fatal assumption of the English commander is utterly destroyed as his elite vanguard turns into an immobile mass of panic. This tactical filtering action instantly neutralizes the entire offensive capability of the Royal Army. Within minutes, the proudest cavalry force in the realm is reduced to a helpless target for Scottish spears. Bruce orders his schiltrons to press downhill with disciplined, rhythmic force, driving their long pikes into the tangled mass of knights. The English rear ranks break and flee before they can even engage, terrified by the instantaneous annihilation of their vanguard. Valence is forced to abandon the field, fleeing to Bothwell Castle in absolute humiliation. The mechanical perfection of the defensive plan transforms a desperate rebellion into a definitive military victory. The strategic landscape changes forever 2 months later when the ultimate driver of the English war effort expires. King Edward I dies at Berg-by-Sands while attempting to cross the border to crush the rebellion personally. His death leaves the English crown to his politically weak son, Edward II, who immediately disbands the northern campaign. This sudden vacuum provides the outlaw king with the critical breathing space required to secure his domestic authority. The removal of the imperial threat allows the Scottish forces to turn inward against their rivals. The Scottish king expects no mercy from the internal factions that supported the murder of his younger brothers. Bruce launches a brutal scorched earth campaign known as the Hership of Buchan, systematically destroying the common heartlands. Smoke rises from burning villages and slaughtered livestock across the Northern Highlands, erasing the power base of his domestic enemies. This merciless purge consolidates absolute control over the fractured realm, establishing his legitimacy through total terror. Within 2 years, the excommunicated outlaw transforms his fragile rebellion into a centralized, sovereign state. How did a sacrilegious murderer, hunted like an animal through the wilderness, manage to defeat a global superpower? The answer lies not in abstract concepts of medieval chivalry, but in the engineering of the ground itself. The standard doctrine of armored cavalry supremacy died in the mud of Loudoun Hill, replaced by mobile commoners wielding simple wooden pikes. This structural shift permanently decentralized military power, proving that tactical adaptation could overcome numerical and economic superiority. The memory of the cages fades as a new national identity begins to solidify. Will the asymmetric tactics forged in the bogs of Galloway hold when the English crown returns with an overwhelming host? The ultimate test of this military evolution awaits on a small stream near Stirling Castle 7 years later. Bruce must scale this defensive system to match a massive army of 20,000 veteran soldiers determined to reverse his gains. The entire future of the kingdom rests on whether a guerrilla warlord can successfully transition into a legitimate sovereign. The path to final independence requires one last definitive confrontation on an open field. Within 2 decades of this bloody conflict, the ultimate recognition of a sovereign, independent Scotland arrives with the formal signing of the Treaty of Northampton. Robert the Bruce dies in peace, recognized as Robert I, a monarch whose character was forged in the absolute darkest hours of survival. Aymer de Valence spends his remaining years attempting to stabilize the collapsing English administration across the volatile northern borders. The road from Loudoun Hill runs directly to the banks of the Bannockburn, where a royal host faces the ultimate evolution of Scottish warfare. Subscribe to stay with this series. The next engagement is already in production. If you are watching on a television screen, the QR code will take you directly to the subscribe button on your phone.